The phone buzzed on the oak dining table just as the aroma of roast beef and mashed potatoes filled our cramped New York apartment's kitchen. It wasn't just any message. It was a text from my dead husband's number. I felt my hands freeze, my heart lurching in a rhythm I hadn't known since his funeral nearly 2 years ago. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and at 73 years old, I thought I understood loss. I thought I understood family. I thought I knew what love looked like. But sitting in that small Queens apartment, watching my daughter-in-law's eyes dart away as she whispered into that phone, "I'll call you back," I realized I understood nothing at all. The apartment felt smaller that evening. The walls seemed to press in around me as I watched Emma slip into the hallway with my dead husband's phone pressed against her ear. The sounds of Astoria buzzed outside. Cars honking, neighbors arguing in 3 different languages, the distant rumble of the N train that shook our building every 20 minutes. But inside, the silence was deafening. You see, I had spent months preparing for this dinner. Months scrubbing every corner of my 2-bedroom apartment, buying groceries with money I could barely spare, practicing conversations in my head. I wanted everything to be perfect. I wanted to feel like a family again. I wanted to stop feeling like a ghost in my own life. But as I stood there in my faded floral dress, the same one I'd worn to Michael's funeral, watching my daughter-in-law handle a phone that should have been buried with my husband, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, crack. Like ice beginning to split before the flood comes. My hands were shaking as I cleared the plates. The roast beef had gone cold. The mashed potatoes sat untouched. Even my grandson Tommy, usually so hungry after his soccer practice, had barely eaten. He kept glancing between me and his mother with those big brown eyes that reminded me so much of his grandfather. I remember thinking, as I scraped food into the garbage disposal, how quiet the apartment felt without Michael's laughter. He used to fill this space with stories from his construction job, jokes about his coworkers, dreams about retirement trips we'd never take. Now, the only sounds were my footsteps on the linoleum floor and the muffled conversation bleeding through the thin walls from Emma's phone call. The apartment had been our sanctuary for 47 years. We'd raised our son Peter here, weathered blackouts and blizzards, watched the neighborhood change from Italian families to young professionals to the beautiful mix of cultures it is today. These walls held our entire life. But that night, they felt like a prison. I had been living alone in this apartment for 22 months. 22 months since the heart attack took Michael while he was watching the morning news, coffee cup still warm in his hand. 22 months of learning how to sleep in an empty bed, how to cook for one person, how to carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs with arthritic hands and a back that reminded me of my age with every step. But the loneliness wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence from my own family. You would think that losing my husband would have brought us closer together. You would think that grief would have been something we could share, something that would remind us how precious time is, how important it is to hold each other tight. Instead, Michael's death seemed to give everyone permission to forget I existed. I remember the funeral. St. Bartholomew's Catholic Church on Northern Boulevard, packed with Michael's co-workers and neighbors and friends from the old country. Everyone had stories to share, shoulders to cry on, memories to preserve. But when the last casserole dish was returned and the last sympathy card was read, the phone call stopped. The visit stopped. The world moved on, and I was left behind in this apartment with his clothes still hanging in the closet and his coffee mug still sitting by the sink. Emma returned to the dining room 20 minutes later, her face flushed and her eyes avoiding mine. She slipped the phone into her purse without a word, as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't just seen her talking on a device that should have been disconnected the day we laid my husband to rest. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. She looked at me with that expression I'd grown to know so well, part pity, part impatience, like I was a confused child asking too many questions. "Just work stuff, Margaret. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it is. I didn't understand how she could have my husband's phone. I didn't understand why she would lie about who she was talking to. And I definitely didn't understand why my son Peter was sitting there, watching this unfold, saying nothing. The thing is, this wasn't the first time I'd felt invisible in my own family. This wasn't the first time I'd sensed secrets being kept, conversations happening around me instead of with me. This wasn't even the first time I'd wondered if the people I loved most in the world saw me as anything more than a burden. Let me tell you about the months before Michael died, because that's where this story really begins. I had been working 2 jobs since I was 68 years old. 2 jobs, at an age when most women are playing with grandchildren and tending to gardens. I cleaned offices in Midtown Manhattan from 5 in the morning until noon, then took the subway home to Queens to work evening shifts at a small grocery store on Steinway Street. My back ached constantly. My feet were permanently swollen. I came home every night exhausted, counting every dollar, every quarter, every penny. But I did it because Peter needed help. Because the economy was tough and his job at the auto parts store didn't pay enough to cover rent and groceries and daycare for Tommy. Because Emma had student loans that seemed to grow larger every month instead of smaller. Because they were my family, and family takes care of each other. I gave them $300 every month from my grocery store paycheck. $300 that could have gone to new shoes for me, or medicine for my arthritis, or maybe even a little savings for emergencies. Instead, it went to my son's family because I believed that's what mothers do. We sacrifice. We give. We put everyone else first, and somehow that's supposed to be enough. Michael used to worry about me working so much. Maggie, he'd say, using the nickname he'd called me since we were teenagers in Brooklyn, you're going to work yourself into the ground. Let the kids figure it out. They're adults. But I couldn't do that. Every time I thought about saying no, I imagined Tommy without enough food or warm clothes. I imagined Peter stressed and angry, taking it out on his family. I imagined Emma looking at me with that disappointed expression that made me feel like I was failing at the most important job I'd ever had, being a mother. So I worked, and I gave, and I told myself that this was temporary, that things would get better, that eventually they'd be grateful for everything I'd done. Michael died on a Tuesday morning in February. I found him in his recliner, still wearing his pajamas, still holding the remote control. The paramedics said it was quick, that he didn't suffer. They said it like that was supposed to be comforting. But all I could think about was how he died alone, while I was scrubbing toilets in an office building 40 minutes away, earning money to give to children who couldn't even be bothered to call and check on us. The funeral was expensive, more expensive than I'd expected, more expensive than I could afford. But Peter assured me he would help. Emma nodded along, promising they'd cover whatever insurance didn't pay for. We picked out a beautiful casket, arranged for flowers, hired a beautiful choir. Michael deserved the best, and I was determined to give it to him, even if it meant spending money I didn't have. After the funeral, I waited for them to follow through on their promises. The bills started arriving, from the funeral home, from the church, from the florist. Thousands of dollars in expenses that insurance covered only partially. Every envelope that arrived in my mailbox felt like another weight pressing down on my chest. When I called Peter to ask about the money he'd promised, he sounded tired and distracted. Mom, I know we talked about it, but things are really tight right now. Emma's been sick, and Tommy needs new soccer equipment, and the car needs repairs. Can you maybe put it on a credit card for now, and we'll pay you back when things settle down? I didn't have a credit card. I'd never needed one before. Michael and I had always paid cash for everything, saved up for the things we wanted, lived within our means. But I was 71 years old, newly widowed, and drowning in bills I couldn't pay. So I applied for a credit card and used it to pay for my husband's funeral. That was the beginning of the end, though I didn't know it at the time. The promises to pay me back became vaguer and vaguer. Soon, Mom. When we get caught up, Mom. You know we're good for it, Mom. Meanwhile, I was still giving them $300 every month, even though my grocery store paycheck was barely enough to cover my own rent and utilities. The credit card bill grew larger every month. The interest charges alone were more than I'd ever spent on groceries for myself. I started eating less, buying generic brands, skipping meals entirely some days. My arthritis got worse because I couldn't afford the good medication anymore. My glasses prescription was 2 years out of date because I couldn't afford to see the eye doctor. But I told myself it was temporary. I told myself they were grieving too. I told myself that family is supposed to help each other, and this was just my turn to be strong. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever given so much of yourself that you forgot there was supposed to be anything left over? Have you ever wondered if the people you love would even notice if you disappeared? The months after Michael's funeral were the loneliest of my life. I would sit in our apartment, my apartment now, surrounded by his things, listening to the sounds of the city outside, waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for someone to remember I existed. My birthday came and went without a card. Mother's Day passed without a phone call. When I got sick with the flu and spent 3 days in bed, fevering and weak, no one checked on me. Mrs. Rodriguez from the apartment next door eventually found me when she noticed my newspapers piling up in the hallway. She brought me soup and medicine and sat with me while I cried. "Where is your family?" she asked in her gentle accent, and I had no answer. I didn't know where they were. I didn't know why they didn't care enough to call. The thing that broke my heart most was Tommy, my grandson, who used to run to me with skinned knees and homework questions, now barely looked at me when they came to visit. Which wasn't often, maybe once a month, usually when they needed something. Money for a school field trip, a babysitter for a weekend, someone to drive across town and pick up something they'd forgotten. I began to suspect that I was less like a mother and grandmother to them and more like an ATM with emotions. Press the right buttons, say the right words, and money comes out. But there was no real relationship, no genuine affection, no interest in who I was as a person beyond what I could provide. The realization came slowly, like a sunrise you don't notice until the darkness is gone and you're standing in full daylight, wondering when everything changed. It was a Saturday in October when I first saw Emma using Michael's phone. I had invited them for dinner, pot roast and vegetables, Tommy's favorite. I'd spent the entire day cooking, cleaning, making sure everything was perfect. They arrived an hour late without apology, and Emma immediately started complaining about traffic, about work, about how tired she was. During dinner, a phone rang. Not Emma's phone, which was sitting on the counter. A different phone with a ringtone I recognized but couldn't place. Michael's ringtone, the theme from The Godfather, which he thought was hilarious because his grandfather had actually known some connected guys back in Brooklyn. Emma reached into her purse and answered it like nothing was unusual, like she hadn't just answered a dead man's phone in front of his widow. "Hello?" she said, stepping into the hallway. "Yeah, I can talk." I sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, feeling like the room was spinning around me. Peter kept eating like nothing had happened. Tommy was playing with his food, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. When she came back, I asked her about it. "Emma, was that Michael's phone?" She looked at me with those cold green eyes and shrugged. "Peter gave it to me. The plan was still active, and it seemed like a waste to cancel it. But that was his phone. His personal phone, with his pictures and his contacts and his... It's just a phone, Margaret. It's not like he's using it anymore." The casual cruelty of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Just a phone. Not the device he used to call me every day during his lunch break. Not the phone that held videos of Tommy's first steps and photos from our anniversary dinners. Not the last connection I had to a man who had been the center of my world for nearly 50 years. Just a phone. That's when I started to understand that maybe I'd been fooling myself about what family meant to these people. Maybe all those sacrifices and all that love and all those years of putting them first had bought me nothing more than the privilege of being taken for granted. But I wasn't ready to accept that yet. I told myself Emma was just being practical. I told myself grief makes people say things they don't mean. I told myself that if I just tried harder, loved more, gave more, eventually they'd see how much they meant to me and start treating me the way I deserved to be treated. So I kept giving, kept working, kept hoping. The second credit card came in the mail just before Thanksgiving. I hadn't applied for it, but somehow my financial information had been used to open an account. When I called the company to report the mistake, they told me the application had been filled out online using my social security number and my address. Someone who knew my personal information had opened a credit card in my name. I looked at the recent charges. Restaurants I'd never been to, stores I'd never shopped at, online purchases for electronics and clothing and things I couldn't even identify. Thousands of dollars in charges I hadn't made. My hands were shaking as I called Peter. "Someone stole my identity," I told him. "Someone opened a credit card in my name and they're using it to buy things. I need to report it to the police." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Too long. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different. Guilty. "Mom, about that card?" "About what card?" "Peter, someone is stealing my money." "No, Mom. Emma needed to buy some things and her credit isn't great right now, so we thought... we were going to pay it back before you even knew about it." I couldn't breathe. I literally could not get air into my lungs. My son, my baby boy who I'd carried for 9 months and raised and loved and sacrificed for, had stolen my identity to open a credit card so his wife could go shopping. "You thought what?" My voice didn't sound like my own voice. It sounded like someone else speaking through me. Someone stronger and angrier than I thought I was capable of being. "It's not stealing, Mom. It's family. We'll pay it back. We always do." But they didn't always pay it back. They'd never paid back a single dollar they'd borrowed from me. Not the funeral expenses, not the monthly $300, not the emergency loans for car repairs and medical bills and Christmas presents. Every month they took, and every month they promised to pay me back soon. And every month I believed them because I wanted to believe them. "Peter," I said, and my voice was steadier now, like something had crystallized inside me. "You need to pay off that card and close it immediately. And you need to never, ever use my personal information for anything again." "Mom, you're overreacting. It's not that big of a deal. We're family. Family helps each other. Family doesn't steal from each other." He hung up on me. My son, who I'd carried and birthed and nursed and loved for 38 years, hung up on me because I objected to him using my identity to rack up debt in my name. I sat in Michael's recliner for a long time after that phone call, looking around our apartment, my apartment, at all the things we'd accumulated over nearly 5 decades together. The wedding photos on the mantle showing us young and hopeful and so in love, the furniture we'd saved up to buy piece by piece over the years, the little ceramic figurines I'd collected from every vacation we'd ever taken. None of it felt like mine anymore. It all felt like set pieces in someone else's play, props in a story I was no longer the main character of. That's when I noticed the bank statements. They were stuck under a stack of magazines on the coffee table, statements for an account I didn't recognize. An account with my name on it, but not my signature on the signature card. An account that had been drained of nearly $8,000 over the past 6 months. $8,000. The money from Michael's life insurance policy. The money I'd been saving for emergencies, for medical expenses, for the uncertain future that comes with being a 73-year-old woman living alone in New York City. All of it gone. The withdrawals were small at first. $50 here, $100 there. Amounts small enough that I might not notice if I wasn't paying close attention, but they got bigger over time. $300, $500. Finally, a withdrawal of $2,000 that had emptied the account completely. Each withdrawal had been made with my debit card. A debit card I kept in my purse, which I kept in my apartment, which I only left when I was at work, or the grocery store or church. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone with a key. Someone who knew where I kept my purse and knew where I kept my important papers and knew how much money I had and exactly how to take it without me noticing right away. Someone in my family. I want you to imagine how that feels for a moment. Imagine discovering that the people you love most in the world, the people you've sacrificed everything for, have been sneaking into your home when you're not there and stealing from you. Imagine realizing that every time they asked you for money, they were already taking money you didn't even know they had access to. Imagine understanding in one horrible moment of clarity that you are not a mother or a grandmother to these people. You are not someone they love or respect or value. You are a resource to be exploited until there's nothing left. I called the bank immediately. I reported the debit card as stolen and demanded they freeze the account and reverse the unauthorized transactions. The customer service representative was polite but firm. Without proof that the withdrawals were unauthorized, without a police report for theft, there was nothing they could do. The card had been used with the correct PIN number, which meant either I had made the withdrawals myself or I had given someone permission to use my card. Ma'am, do you have any family members who might have access to your banking information? Yes. Yes, I did. I had a son who had keys to my apartment and knew where I kept my important papers. I had a daughter-in-law who apparently felt entitled to use my dead husband's phone and my personal information. I had a family who saw me as an ATM instead of a human being. But how do you explain that to a stranger on the phone? How do you say that the people who are supposed to love you have been systematically robbing you blind? I hung up the phone and did something I hadn't done since Michael's funeral. I cried. Not the quiet, dignified tears I'd shed at the cemetery, but ugly, body-shaking sobs that came from the deepest part of my grief and rage and disappointment. I cried for the money that was gone. I cried for the trust that was broken. I cried for the mother I used to be, who believed that love was enough to make people treat you with kindness and respect. Most of all, I cried for Michael, who had died believing we'd raised a good son who would take care of his mother when he was gone. When I was done crying, I did something else I hadn't done in a very long time. I got angry. Real anger. The kind of anger that burns away self-doubt and excuses and wishful thinking. The kind of anger that shows you who you really are when everything else is stripped away. I was not going to be anyone's victim. Not anymore. The next morning, I went to the bank in person. I closed all my old accounts and opened new ones with different account numbers and new debit cards. I changed all my passwords and security questions. I put a freeze on my credit report so no one could open new accounts in my name. Then I called a locksmith and had all the locks changed on my apartment. Every single one. The front door, the deadbolt. Even the little chain lock that Michael had installed after the break-in started happening in our building a few years back. When Peter called that afternoon, wanting to know why his key didn't work anymore, I told him the truth. Because I don't trust you anymore. Because you've been stealing from me and I'm done pretending it's okay because we're family. Mom, that's crazy. We would never... $8,000, Peter. $8,000 from the account with Dad's life insurance money. Did you think I wouldn't notice eventually? Silence on the other end of the line. Then, Mom, we can explain... No. No more explanations. No more excuses. No more promises you have no intention of keeping. What are you saying? I took a deep breath. I'm saying that if you want to be part of my life, you need to start treating me with respect. You need to pay back every dollar you've taken from me. You need to apologize and mean it, and never do anything like this again. And if we don't? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Like he was betting I didn't have the courage to follow through, that I would back down and apologize and go back to being the easy mark I'd always been. Then you don't get to be part of my life anymore. I hung up before he could respond. I sat there in my newly secure apartment, listening to the sounds of the city outside, the hum of traffic, the distant music from someone's radio, the voices of children playing in the courtyard below, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Not happiness, not yet, but peace. The quiet that comes when you stop fighting a battle you can't win and start fighting for something you can actually protect. Yourself. For the next few days, my phone rang constantly. Peter calling to argue with me, to tell me I was being unreasonable, that I was tearing the family apart over money. Emma calling to explain that they'd only borrowed what they needed, that they'd always intended to pay me back, that I was being cruel and selfish. I stopped answering. Instead, I did something I hadn't done since before Michael got sick. I took care of myself. I went to the doctor and got my eyes examined and updated my prescription. I bought groceries without counting every penny, including some of the good cheese I used to buy when Michael was alive. I signed up for a senior citizens yoga class at the community center down the street. I also did something that felt almost revolutionary. I stopped giving them money. When Peter called and asked for the usual $300 for rent, I said no. When Emma texted asking me to cover Tommy's soccer registration fees, I said no. When they called with their usual emergency, car trouble, medical bills, unexpected expenses, I said no. Each no felt like a small victory, like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd given away without even realizing it. But the hardest part wasn't saying no to their requests for money. The hardest part was accepting that they might choose money over a relationship with me. And that's exactly what happened. The phone call stopped. The visit stopped. When I tried to call to speak to Tommy, Emma would answer and tell me he was busy. He was at practice. He was doing homework. When I offered to take him to the park or the museum or just to get ice cream, there was always a reason why it wasn't a good time. I was being punished for setting boundaries. I was being frozen out for refusing to be taken advantage of. The message was clear. If I wasn't going to be useful, then I wasn't going to be part of the family. The loneliness was crushing. There were days when I didn't speak to another human being except the cashier at the grocery store. There were nights when I sat in Michael's chair, looking at photos of Tommy when he was little, wondering if I'd made the right choice. But then I would remember the feeling of discovering that money missing from my account. I would remember the casual way Emma had dismissed my feelings about Michael's phone. I would remember my son hanging up on me when I objected to having my identity stolen. And I would know, with absolute certainty, that I had made the only choice I could live with. Spring came early that year. The trees in the courtyard below my apartment began to bud, and the air started smelling like possibility instead of exhaust fumes and winter garbage. I found myself spending more time by the window, watching the world wake up from its long sleep. That's when Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on my door. "Margaret," she said in her warm, accented voice, "you look thin? Are you eating enough?" I realized suddenly that I couldn't remember the last time someone had asked me that question out of genuine concern for my well-being, rather than as small talk or politeness. "I'm fine," I said, but she gave me a look that said she didn't believe me for a second. "Come," she said, taking my arm gently. "I made too much arroz con pollo. You help me eat it." Her apartment was identical to mine in layout, but completely different in feeling. Where my walls were mostly bare now, I'd taken down a lot of the family photos after the locks were changed. Hers were covered with pictures of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The air was warm and fragrant with spices and something indefinably comforting that I eventually realized was the smell of a home where people were loved and welcomed. Over dinner, she told me about her family. Her 3 children, all successful and living in different states, who called her every Sunday without fail. Her 7 grandchildren, who sent her artwork from school and videos of their school plays. Her 2 great-grandchildren, who were just learning to walk and talk and already knew how to blow kisses to Abuela through the phone. "They are good children," she said simply. "They remember where they come from." I found myself telling her about Peter and Emma and Tommy, about the money and the lying and the way I'd been cut off from my own grandson because I dared to say no to being robbed. She listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, making small sounds of sympathy and understanding. When I was finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "My mother used to say something," she finally said. "She used to say that you teach people how to treat you. If you allow someone to disrespect you, they will keep disrespecting you. If you allow someone to take from you without giving back, they will keep taking until there is nothing left. But they're my family. Family is not a license to abuse someone. Family is not an excuse to steal or lie or hurt someone you claim to love. Real family, real love. It lifts you up. It doesn't tear you down. She reached across the table and patted my hand with fingers that were spotted with age but still strong and warm. You did the right thing, she said. It hurts now, but you did the right thing. I cried in her kitchen that night. Not the angry tears I'd shed in my apartment, but something deeper and more healing. The tears of someone who had been carrying a burden alone for so long that she'd forgotten how good it felt to share the weight. When I got back to my apartment, I noticed something had been slipped under my door while I was gone. A letter written on legal office stationery, with my name typed on the front. Inside was a document I didn't understand, full of legal language and official stamps. But the gist was clear enough. Peter and Emma were suing me. They were claiming that I had promised to provide financial support for their family, that they had made financial decisions based on that promise, and that my sudden withdrawal of support was causing them financial and emotional hardship. They were suing me for the money I wouldn't give them. They were trying to use the court system to force me to continue being their ATM. I sat on my couch, staring at the legal papers, and I started laughing. Not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd, so perfectly representative of everything that was wrong with our relationship. That laughter was the only response that made sense. They had stolen my identity, emptied my bank accounts, lied to me, manipulated me, and cut me off from my grandson. And now they were suing me because I had the audacity to object to being robbed. But you know what? I wasn't scared. For the first time in this entire nightmare, I wasn't scared or confused or second-guessing myself. I was crystal clear about what needed to happen next. The next morning, I called the community center and asked if they had any recommendations for legal aid attorneys who worked with senior citizens. Within an hour, I had an appointment with a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse and financial exploitation. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she was younger than Emma, but infinitely more respectful and professional. She listened to my story, looked at my bank records and the legal papers Peter and Emma had sent, and shook her head in disgust. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "what they've done to you is not just morally wrong, it's criminal. Identity theft, unauthorized use of banking information, financial elder abuse, these are serious crimes and there are serious consequences." "I don't want them to go to jail," I said quickly. "They're still my family, even after everything." "I understand, but you don't have to be passive about this. You can fight back. You can protect yourself and maybe prevent them from doing this to someone else." She explained my options. I could file criminal complaints for the identity theft and unauthorized banking access. I could countersue for the return of all the money they'd taken from me, plus interest and damages. I could get a restraining order if they continued to harass me. "What I recommend," she said, "is that we file a response to their lawsuit that includes a counterclaim for every dollar they've taken from you, documented with bank records and receipts. Let them explain to a judge why they think they're entitled to sue you for money while they've been systematically robbing you blind." "Will that work?" "Mrs. Patterson, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've seen a lot of families destroy themselves over money, but I've never seen a case where the victims were suing the person they victimized. Most attorneys won't even take a case like this. It's too easy to prove that your son and daughter-in-law are the ones in the wrong." For the first time in months, I felt hope. The legal process moved slowly, but Sarah kept me informed every step of the way. Peter and Emma's attorney, a cut-rate lawyer who specialized in frivolous lawsuits, quickly realized they didn't have a case. When faced with bank records showing unauthorized withdrawals, credit card applications using stolen personal information, and a clear pattern of financial abuse, their legal strategy seemed to be to hope I would settle out of court just to make it go away. But I wasn't the same woman who had been quietly accepting mistreatment for months. I wasn't interested in making anything go away. I wanted justice. I wanted accountability. I wanted them to understand that there are consequences when you abuse someone's trust and love. The turning point came when Sarah subpoenaed their financial records as part of our countersuit. It turned out that Peter and Emma owned assets worth significantly more than they'd ever told me about. They had a portfolio of stocks and cryptocurrency investments worth over $100,000. They had savings accounts with substantial balances. They owned their car outright and had been making double payments on their mortgage for 2 years. They weren't struggling financially. They weren't desperate or facing hardship. They were financially comfortable, possibly even wealthy by normal standards. They had been stealing from me not because they needed the money, but because it was easier than spending their own. That revelation hurt more than the theft itself. It meant that every sob story, every emergency, every plea for help had been a calculated manipulation. It meant that while I was working 2 jobs and skipping meals and unable to afford my arthritis medication, they were building wealth and living comfortably on money they stolen from me. When the evidence of their financial situation was presented to their lawyer, Peter and Emma's lawsuit collapsed immediately. Their attorney withdrew from the case, probably realizing he'd been lied to about the circumstances. Within a week, we received a settlement offer. They would drop their lawsuit, return all the money they'd taken from me, and agree to a restraining order that would prevent them from contacting me or coming to my apartment without permission. It should have felt like victory, and part of it did. But mostly it felt like the end of something that had already been dead for a long time. The final acknowledgement that the family I thought I had never existed in the first place. I signed the settlement agreement on a Tuesday afternoon in late March. Sarah walked me through every detail, made sure I understood my rights and their obligations. When it was done, she shook my hand and said something I'll never forget. "Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that what you did took tremendous courage. Most people in your situation never fight back. They let themselves be victimized over and over because they're afraid of being alone. But you chose to protect yourself, even when it was hard. I'm proud of you." Walking home from the lawyer's office that day, I felt lighter than I had in years. The city around me seemed brighter, the air cleaner, the sounds more musical than jarring. Spring was fully underway, and for the first time I could remember, I felt like I was part of it instead of trapped behind a window watching it happen to other people. That evening, as I was making dinner for one, something I'd gotten good at and even learned to enjoy, someone knocked on my new locks. Through the peephole, I could see Mrs. Rodriguez holding what looked like a covered dish. "I made flan," she announced when I opened the door. "Too much for one person." We sat at my small dining table, sharing her incredible flan and talking about everything except families and lawsuits and broken trust. She told me about the novel she was reading, about the soap opera she was addicted to, about her plans to visit her daughter in California over the summer. "You should travel too," she said. "You have no one to answer to now. You could go anywhere you want." The idea was startling. When was the last time I'd traveled anywhere alone? When was the last time I'd made plans that were just for me, just because I wanted to do something? "I wouldn't even know where to go," I said. "Start small. There's a bus tour to Atlantic City next weekend. Senior citizen discount. Or the Botanical Garden in Brooklyn. Or just take the train to Central Park and walk around like a tourist." That night, I got out an old photo album I hadn't looked at in years. Pictures from the trips Michael and I had taken when we were younger and had more money and energy. Niagara Falls for our honeymoon, Washington, D.C. when Peter was 12, a long weekend in Boston when we celebrated our 25th anniversary. Looking at those photos, I realized how young we looked, how happy, how full of plans and dreams and possibilities. When had I stopped believing I deserved to be happy? When had I started believing that sacrifice and suffering were the same thing as love? Michael used to say that we were going to travel when he retired. See the Grand Canyon, visit Italy to see where his grandparents came from, take a cruise to Alaska. We had plans and dreams and a whole life we were going to live together. But Michael was gone, and those dreams were gone with him. I could either spend the rest of my life mourning what we'd never have, or I could start figuring out what I wanted my life to look like now. For the first time in 2 years, I started making plans that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or expectations. The settlement money arrived in my new bank account 6 weeks later. It was more than I'd expected. Not just the money they'd stolen, but interest and damages as well. Enough to pay off the credit cards I'd been struggling with since Michael's funeral. Enough to build a small emergency fund. Enough to stop working at the grocery store and focus on taking better care of myself. I celebrated by doing something I'd never done in my entire life. I bought something expensive just because I wanted it. A beautiful cashmere sweater in deep purple, a color Michael used to say brought out my eyes. I wore it to dinner at Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment, and she whistled appreciatively. "Purple is definitely your color," she said. "You look like a woman who knows her worth." That phrase stuck with me. A woman who knows her worth. For so long, I'd measured my worth by how much I could give to other people, how much I could sacrifice, how much I could endure without complaint. I'd never considered that my worth might be inherent, something that existed independent of my usefulness to other people. Summer came, and with it a routine I'd never had before. Mornings at the community center, taking a watercolor painting class taught by a retired art teacher who praised my use of color and encouraged me to paint whatever made me happy. Afternoons reading in the courtyard behind my building, finally working through the stack of novels I'd been meaning to read for years. Evenings either cooking dinner for myself or joining Mrs. Rodriguez for one of her incredible meals. I painted pictures of flowers and cityscapes and abstract swirls of color that didn't represent anything except how I felt when I mixed the paints on my palette. I read romance novels and mysteries and biographies of women who had accomplished extraordinary things. I learned to enjoy my own company in a way I'd never been able to when I was constantly worried about other people's needs. It was the most peaceful summer of my adult life. And then, in late August, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. The number was blocked, and I'd gotten into the habit of letting unknown calls go to voicemail. But something made me pick up on the fourth ring. Grandma? It was Tommy, my grandson, who I hadn't spoken to in almost 6 months. His voice was deeper than I remembered, cracking in the way that meant he was growing up too fast. Tommy? My heart started racing. How did you get this number? I asked Mrs. Rodriguez. She gave it to me when I came by your apartment looking for you. You came by my apartment? Yeah, Grandma, are you okay? Mom and Dad said you were sick, that you weren't allowed to see anyone, but Mrs. Rodriguez said that wasn't true. She said you guys had a big fight about money. I closed my eyes, feeling anger and sadness wash over me in equal measure. Even now, even after everything, they were lying to him, making me the villain in a story where I was the victim. I'm fine, sweetheart, I'm not sick. Your parents and we had some problems and we're not talking right now. Because of money? How do you explain financial abuse to a 12-year-old? How do you tell your grandson that his parents have been stealing from you without destroying his relationship with them? It's complicated, Tommy. Adult problems. I miss you, Grandma. I miss our trips to the park and the movies and the way you used to help me with my math homework. I started crying then, because I missed him too. Because I'd lost so much more than money when I set boundaries with his parents. Because a 12-year-old boy was paying the price for his parents' greed and my need to protect myself. I miss you too, baby. So much. Can I come see you? Not with Mom and Dad, just me? I don't know if your parents would allow that. They don't have to know. I could take the bus after school and come for a couple hours and be home before dinner. Please, Grandma, I just want to see you. I thought about the restraining order, about how Peter and Emma would react if they found out I was seeing Tommy without their permission. I thought about the legal consequences and the emotional turmoil and all the reasons I should say no. And then I thought about how much I loved this boy, how much I'd missed watching him grow up, how unfair it was that he was being kept away from me as punishment for refusing to be robbed. Okay, I said, but we have to be careful. And if your parents find out and ask you to stop coming, you have to listen to them. I don't want you to get in trouble because of me. I won't get in trouble. And Grandma, I'm glad you're not sick. He came to see me every Tuesday after school for the rest of the summer and into the fall. We would sit in my apartment or walk around the neighborhood, and he would tell me about school and his friends and the books he was reading. I would show him my paintings, and we would work on his homework together the way we used to. The most amazing thing was how mature he'd become, how thoughtful and aware of the world around him. He asked me questions about Michael, about what it was like to be married for so long, about whether I ever got lonely. He told me about his dreams for the future, his concerns about his parents, his confusion about why adults seem to make everything so complicated. Mom and Dad fight about money a lot, he said one afternoon as we were walking through the park near my apartment. Dad says it's your fault that you're being selfish, but Mom says some things that don't make sense. Like what? Like she talks about this credit card that's in your name, but she's the one who uses it. And she has Grandpa's old phone, which seems weird to me. Shouldn't you have Grandpa's phone? I stopped walking. She still has your grandfather's phone? Yeah. She uses it all the time. Says it gets better reception than her phone, but that doesn't make sense because it's like 3 years older than hers. Something cold settled in my stomach. Emma still had Michael's phone, even after everything that had happened, even after the lawsuit and the settlement and the restraining order. She was still holding on to something that belonged to my husband, something that should have been returned to me or at the very least been put to rest with him. But why? What could she possibly want with a dead man's phone? That night, after Tommy went home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started making a list of all the things that bothered me about Emma having Michael's phone, the way she'd answered it so casually at dinner that night, like it was perfectly normal, the way she'd dismissed my feelings about it, the secretive phone calls she'd made while we were supposed to be having a family meal. Who was she talking to on my dead husband's phone? And why was it so important that she keep it even now, when she had to know how much it hurt me? I spent the next few days trying to put it out of my mind, but it kept nagging at me. During my painting class, during my walks around the neighborhood, during quiet evenings reading in my chair, I kept coming back to that phone. Finally, I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I called Michael's old number. It rang 4 times before Emma answered, sounding breathless and annoyed. What? For a moment, I couldn't speak. Hearing her voice coming through Michael's phone, the phone that had been in his pocket when he died, that still had his voicemail message and his contacts and his photos, felt like a violation I couldn't put into words. Emma, it's Margaret. Silence. Then, you're not supposed to contact us. The restraining order. The restraining order says you can't contact me. It doesn't say I can't call to ask for my husband's belongings back. It's just a phone. It was his phone. It should go to me. Or at the very least, it should be disconnected as a sign of respect for the dead. Why are you so determined to keep it? More silence. I could hear voices in the background, people talking and laughing. She was somewhere social, using my husband's phone while she lived her life, and I grieved alone. I need to go, she said. Emma, please. Just tell me why. What could you possibly need with that phone that's worth hurting me over? She hung up, but something in her voice, something in the way she'd avoided answering my question, told me there was more to this story. Emma wasn't keeping Michael's phone out of practicality or even cruelty. She was keeping it for a reason I didn't understand yet. I started paying more attention when Tommy visited. I asked casual questions about his parents' routine, their friends, their activities. Not because I wanted to spy on them, but because I was trying to piece together a puzzle I couldn't quite see the shape of. What I learned surprised me. According to Tommy, Peter was working more hours than ever, often coming home exhausted and stressed. Emma, on the other hand, seemed to have a lot of free time. She went out several evenings a week, sometimes not coming home until after Tommy was in bed. She'd started dressing differently, wearing nicer clothes and more makeup. She'd even joined a gym and started taking yoga classes. She says it's important for her to have me time, Tommy told me with a slight roll of his eyes. But she never wants family time anymore. We hardly ever eat dinner together, and she's always on her phone. Which phone? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Both of them. Her regular phone and Grandpa's old one. She carries them both everywhere. 2 phones. One that was hers, registered in her name, with her contacts and her life on it, and one that belonged to a dead man, that she used for secret conversations and mysterious errands. I spent the next week thinking about what that could mean, and I didn't like any of the conclusions I was reaching. The night I figured it out, I was lying in bed listening to the sounds of the city outside my window. Police sirens, late-night traffic, the distant hum of people living their lives after dark. That's when it occurred to me to wonder who was paying for Michael's phone plan. I'd assumed that Peter and Emma had simply kept the existing plan active, maybe because it was cheaper than canceling it and starting a new one. But phone plans don't just continue indefinitely without someone paying for them. Someone was getting bills for Michael's phone service, and someone was paying those bills every month. The next morning, I called the wireless company. After being transferred 3 times and verifying my identity with Michael's social security number and our old account information, I finally reached someone who could help me. Yes, ma'am, that line is still active. The account holder is, let me see, Michael Patterson, but the billing goes to a different address now. What address? She gave me an address I didn't recognize. Not Peter and Emma's house, not my apartment. Somewhere in Manhattan, in a neighborhood I'd never been to. And who's been paying the bills? The payments have been coming from a joint bank account belonging to Emma Patterson and, oh, this is interesting. Emma Patterson and Michael Patterson. My blood went cold. That's impossible. Michael Patterson died 2 years ago. According to our records, ma'am, Michael Patterson opened this joint account 18 months ago and has been making automatic payments from it ever since. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, staring at my hands, trying to process what I'd just heard. 18 months ago, 6 months after Michael died, someone had opened a bank account in his name. Someone had been using his identity to maintain his phone service and probably other accounts as well. Someone had been pretending my husband was still alive. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. The text message from Michael's number that had started all of this. The secretive phone calls Emma made when she thought no one was paying attention. The second phone she carried everywhere but never seemed to use for normal calls or texts. Emma wasn't just using Michael's phone. She was using Michael's identity. She was pretending to be my dead husband, conducting some kind of business or relationship or scam that required people to believe he was still alive. And if she was doing that, if she was committing identity theft on this scale, then what I'd discovered about the credit cards and bank accounts was probably just the tip of the iceberg. I called Sarah Chen immediately. Mrs. Patterson, are you sure about this? She asked after I'd explained what I'd learned. Because identity theft of a deceased person is a serious federal crime. If you're right, your daughter-in-law could be looking at years in prison. I'm sure. Michael has been dead for 2 years, and someone has been using his name to open bank accounts and maintain phone service. It has to be Emma. We'll need proof. Bank records, phone records, documentation that shows she's been using his identity for fraudulent purposes. How do we get that? Very carefully, and probably with the help of law enforcement. The investigation took 3 months. 3 months of meetings with FBI agents who specialized in identity theft and financial crimes. 3 months of gathering evidence and building a case that would hold up in court. 3 months of learning just how extensive Emma's fraud had been. It wasn't just Michael's phone and a joint bank account. Over the 18 months since his death, Emma had opened 7 credit cards in Michael's name, taken out a personal loan for $15,000, and filed tax returns claiming refunds for income he'd supposedly earned while he was dead. She'd even tried to claim a Social Security survivor benefit while simultaneously filing paperwork suggesting he was still alive and working. The scam was sophisticated and far-reaching. Emma had been using Michael's identity to borrow money, build credit, and create financial assets that she could access while keeping them hidden from her husband and anyone else who might ask questions about her sudden financial resources. The address in Manhattan turned out to be a mail forwarding service that specialized in helping people maintain multiple identities. For a monthly fee, they would receive mail at various addresses and forward it wherever the customer wanted it sent. Emma had been using the service to make it appear that Michael was living in Manhattan, working at a consulting firm that existed only on paper, and maintaining a completely fictional life. The most disturbing part was how long she'd been planning it. According to the FBI investigation, Emma had started researching identity theft techniques and mail forwarding services just 2 weeks after Michael's funeral. While I was grieving my husband and struggling to figure out how to live without him, she'd been planning to exploit his death for financial gain. When the FBI arrested her, she was using Michael's identity to apply for a mortgage on a condo in Florida. She'd apparently been planning to buy real estate using a dead man's credit and financial profile, probably intending to rent it out or sell it for profit somewhere down the line. The arrest made the local news. Local woman charged an elaborate identity theft scheme using dead father-in-law's information. Seeing Emma's mugshot on the evening news, looking haggard and scared and completely different from the confident, dismissive woman who'd been stealing from me for 2 years, should have felt like justice. Instead, it felt like the final death of any hope I'd had that we could ever be a real family. Peter called me the night after the arrest. It was the first time I'd heard his voice since the lawsuit was settled, and he sounded destroyed. "Mom, did you know? Did you know what Emma was doing with Dad's identity?" "I suspected something," I said, "but I didn't know how bad it was until the FBI investigation." "The FBI? You called the FBI on my wife?" I closed my eyes. Even now, even with overwhelming evidence of Emma's crimes, he was making me the villain. "I called them when I discovered she'd been using your father's identity to commit fraud. Peter, she opened bank accounts in a dead man's name. She filed tax returns for someone who's been buried for 2 years. She was planning to buy real estate with his stolen identity. This wasn't just about the money she took from me. This was serious criminal activity. But you could have talked to us first. You could have given us a chance to work it out, family. Like you worked it out when you stole my identity to open credit cards? Like you worked it out when you emptied my bank accounts? Like you worked it out when you sued me for refusing to keep giving you money?" Silence. "Peter, I gave you chances. I gave you so many chances to be honest, to make things right, to treat me with basic respect. You chose instead to take more and lie more and hurt me more. I'm done protecting people who won't protect me. What am I supposed to tell Tommy? Tell him the truth. Tell him his mother made some very bad choices and now she has to face the consequences. Tell him that actions have consequences and that stealing is wrong even when you're stealing from family. She's going to prison, Mom. They're saying she could get 5 to 10 years for this." Yes, she probably is. And that's not my fault or my responsibility. That's the natural consequence of what she chose to do. How can you be so cold? I thought about that question for a long time after I hung up the phone. How could I be so cold? How could I feel so little sympathy for a woman who was facing prison time, even if that woman had been systematically abusing me for years? The answer I realized was that I wasn't cold. I was simply done being warm to people who used my warmth against me. I was done sacrificing my well-being to protect people who wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice me for their convenience. I had learned, finally and completely, the difference between love and enabling, between being kind and being a doormat, between supporting family and allowing family to destroy you. Emma pled guilty to multiple counts of identity theft and fraud. She was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution to all her victims, including me, for the money she'd stolen and the financial damage she'd caused. Peter filed for divorce while she was awaiting sentencing. He moved back into his childhood bedroom in my old apartment building. Not with me, but in a unit down the hall that came available when Mr. Chen moved to Florida. It was awkward, seeing him in the elevator sometimes, passing him in the laundry room. But we were polite to each other. Distantly civilized in the way you might be with a neighbor you don't particularly like but have to get along with. Tommy started spending more time with me after his mother went to prison. Not just Tuesday afternoons, but whole weekends sometimes. Peter seemed relieved to have someone else help with parenting duties, and I was grateful to have my grandson back in my life regularly. We talked about what had happened, carefully and age-appropriately. I explained that his mother had made some bad choices that hurt people, and that sometimes adults have to go away for a while when they break important rules. I told him that none of what happened was his fault, that he was loved and safe, and that his family, whatever it looked like now, would figure out how to move forward. He was remarkably resilient, the way children often are when adults stop lying to them and start treating them with respect for their intelligence and emotional capacity. He was sad about his mother being away, angry about the disruption to his life, confused about how family relationships were supposed to work when half the family was in prison. But he was also relieved. In a way, I think he didn't fully understand yet. The constant tension in his house was gone. The fighting about money had stopped. His father, no longer covering for Emma's lies or defending her abuse, was becoming a more present and attentive parent. "Dad's different now," Tommy told me one Saturday as we worked on a jigsaw puzzle together. "He actually listens when I talk to him, and he doesn't seem so angry all the time." "People sometimes change when they're not in bad situations anymore," I said. "Your dad was stressed for a long time, trying to hold everything together. Maybe now he can relax a little." "Are you ever going to be friends with Dad again?" It was a fair question. Peter and I were civil now, cooperative in matters involving Tommy's care and well-being. When Tommy needed something for school or had a medical appointment or wanted to do something that required coordination between his households, Peter and I could have functional, respectful conversations. But friends? I wasn't sure that was possible anymore. Too much had happened. Too much trust had been broken. I could forgive him, for my own peace of mind, because carrying anger forever is exhausting. But I couldn't forget what I'd learned about who he was when he thought he could get away with treating me badly. "I think your dad and I will always be Tommy's grandmother and Tommy's father," I said carefully. "And that means we'll always be connected through you, and we'll always work together to make sure you're happy and healthy and loved. But adult relationships are complicated, and sometimes people can't go back to the way things used to be. Because of the money? Not just because of the money, because of trust. When someone breaks your trust, especially someone in your family, it changes the relationship forever. It doesn't mean you stop loving them, but it means you have to be more careful about protecting yourself." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. At 13 now, he was old enough to understand that the world was more complex than he'd once believed, that people weren't simply good or bad, but capable of both kindness and cruelty, depending on circumstances and choices. That conversation happened almost a year after Emma's sentencing, on a crisp October afternoon when the light was starting to change and the city was putting on its autumn colors. We were sitting in the small park near my apartment, watching people walk their dogs and push strollers and live their normal, complicated lives. "Grandma?" Tommy said as we were packing up our puzzle to head back to the apartment. "I'm glad you didn't let them keep hurting you." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm glad you stood up for yourself, even though it was hard and everyone was mad at you for a while. I think you're braver than you know." I looked at this boy, nearly as tall as me now, with his grandfather's eyes and his own developing sense of justice, and felt something I'd almost forgotten how to feel. Pride. Not pride in sacrifice or endurance or how much I could give away, but pride in my own strength, my own worth, my own capacity to protect myself and create a life worth living. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot to me. Will you teach me how to do that? How to stand up for myself when people try to take advantage of me?" "Of course. But I hope you never have to use those skills with people you love. But if I do, I'll know how, right? Because you showed me that it's okay to protect yourself, even when it makes other people angry." Walking home that afternoon, I realized that maybe the most important thing I'd accomplished in this whole terrible, painful, transformative experience wasn't protecting my money or getting justice or even rebuilding my relationship with Tommy. Maybe the most important thing was showing him that love doesn't require you to accept abuse, that family relationships should lift you up, not tear you down, that there's a difference between sacrifice and self-destruction, between generosity and enabling, between being kind and being a victim. Tommy would grow up knowing that he deserves to be treated with respect, even by people who claim to love him. He would know that it's okay to say no when saying yes would hurt him. He would know that real love, healthy love, doesn't ask you to betray yourself or compromise your well-being for someone else's convenience. That knowledge might save him from years of pain and confusion and self-doubt. It might help him build relationships based on mutual respect instead of exploitation. It might give him the courage to protect himself and the wisdom to recognize when protection is necessary. If I accomplished nothing else in my remaining years, that would be enough. The second winter after Emma's sentencing was different from any winter I could remember. For the first time since Michael died, I wasn't dreading the holidays. I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment or rejection or being forgotten by my family. I had no expectations beyond the simple pleasure of decorating my apartment, baking cookies for Mrs. Rodriguez, and spending Christmas Eve with Tommy making hot chocolate and watching old movies. Peter had loosened up about the custody arrangement, recognizing that Tommy was happier and more stable when he had regular contact with me. We'd worked out a schedule that gave Tommy 2 weekends a month at my place, plus dinner together once a week, plus any school events or activities where having an extra supportive adult would be helpful. It wasn't the close-knit extended family I'd once dreamed of having, but it was healthy and functional and built on honesty instead of manipulation. Tommy felt secure and loved. Peter was learning to be a single parent without the constant drama and financial pressure that had defined his marriage. I was enjoying being a grandmother without feeling exploited or taken for granted. On Christmas morning, Tommy and I made pancakes together while snow fell outside my kitchen window. He showed me the presents he'd gotten from Peter, mostly clothes and books and a new soccer ball, and I gave him the art supplies I'd picked out, along with a sketch pad and an easel that folded up small enough to fit in his room at either house. "I want to learn to paint like you," he said, already experimenting with the different brushes I'd bought him. "Will you teach me?" "Of course. We'll start with watercolors. They're forgiving, good for beginners." What does that mean, forgiving? I thought about how to explain it. It means that if you make a mistake, you can work with it instead of starting over. You can add water to soften hard edges, or add more color to change the tone, or even incorporate accidents into the design. Watercolor teaches you to be flexible and creative instead of trying to control everything perfectly. Like life? Very much like life. We spent the afternoon painting together. Abstract swirls of color, winter trees against snowy skies, attempts at portraits that looked more like friendly aliens than actual people. Tommy was focused and patient in a way that reminded me of his grandfather, mixing colors carefully and thinking about each brushstroke before committing it to paper. "Grandma, do you miss Grandpa on days like this?" "Every day," I said honestly, "but especially on holidays." He loved Christmas morning. He would get up early and make coffee and sit by the tree, just enjoying the quiet before everyone else woke up. "Do you think he would be proud of you? For everything that happened with Mom and Dad?" It was a question I'd asked myself many times over the past 2 years. Michael had loved Peter so much, had been so proud of him, had worked so hard to provide for our family. Would he have understood my decision to cut them off when they were mistreating me? Would he have supported my choice to protect myself, even when it meant watching our son face consequences for his wife's criminal behavior? "I think your grandfather would be proud that I learned to value myself," I said finally. "He always told me I was too generous, too forgiving, too willing to let people take advantage of my good nature. I think he would be happy to see me standing up for myself. Even though it meant Dad got divorced and Mom went to prison, your grandfather would be sad about what happened to your family, but he wouldn't blame me for your mother's choices or your father's choices. He would understand that everyone is responsible for their own actions, and that protecting myself wasn't the same thing as hurting them." Tommy nodded, adding a touch of yellow to a blue wash he was working on, watching the colors blend and flow together on the paper. "I think I understand that too," he said. That evening, after Tommy had gone home to have dinner with Peter, I sat in Michael's old chair with a cup of tea and looked around my apartment. It was quieter than it used to be when he was alive and our life was full of his presence and energy, but it wasn't lonely anymore. It was peaceful. I'd repainted the living room in warm gold tones that made the space feel larger and more cheerful. I'd hung my best watercolor paintings on the walls, cityscapes and flowers and abstract expressions of color and mood that made me happy to look at. I'd bought new curtains and throw pillows and a soft blanket that I wrapped around myself on cold evenings like this one. The apartment felt like mine now, not like a museum to a life that was over. It felt like a home where a woman lived who had survived loss and betrayal and learned to create joy for herself instead of waiting for other people to provide it. On the table next to my chair was a letter that had arrived the day before Christmas Eve, from Emma, postmarked from the federal prison where she was serving her sentence. I'd been carrying it around for 2 days, unsure whether I wanted to read it or simply throw it away. Finally, that quiet Christmas evening, I decided to open it. The handwriting was different, smaller and more careful than when I'd known her. The tone was different too, humble in a way Emma had never been before. "Dear Margaret," it began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand if you throw this letter away without reading it, but I wanted to try to explain some things and to apologize for everything I put you through. I know that saying I'm sorry isn't enough. I know that what I did was wrong in ways I'm only beginning to understand. When I started using Michael's identity, I told myself it was just temporary, just until Peter and I got back on our feet financially. But that was a lie. The truth is that I felt entitled to that money, to those opportunities, to whatever I could take from your family because I resented how much Peter worried about you and wanted to take care of you. I was jealous of the relationship you and Peter had. I was angry that he always wanted to give you money we couldn't afford to give. I convinced myself that you were manipulating him, taking advantage of his feelings of guilt about Michael's death. I thought that if I could just get you out of the picture financially, Peter would stop feeling responsible for your well-being and focus entirely on our family. But I was wrong about everything. I was wrong about your relationship with Peter. I was wrong about your motivations. I was wrong to think that financial abuse was justified by jealousy or resentment. I was wrong to drag Tommy into the middle of adult problems that had nothing to do with him. Most of all, I was wrong to use Michael's identity to commit crimes. I know how much he meant to you, how much his memory means to you, and I violated that in a way that must have felt like losing him all over again. I can't imagine how painful it was to discover that I was pretending to be your dead husband for financial gain. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to respond to this letter or to have any contact with me ever again. But I wanted you to know that I take full responsibility for what I did. It wasn't Peter's fault. He didn't know about the identity theft until the FBI investigation. It wasn't your fault for setting boundaries or protecting yourself. It was entirely my fault for making choices that hurt people I should have been treating with love and respect. I hope that you and Tommy are able to maintain your relationship despite everything I've done to complicate it. He loves you very much, and he's told me in his letters how much your support means to him. You're a good grandmother, and you deserved so much better from all of us. I hope you found some peace and happiness despite the pain I caused. Sincerely, Emma. I read the letter twice, then set it on the table and stared out the window at the Christmas lights twinkling in apartment windows across the courtyard. It was a good apology. Honest and specific, and without attempts to minimize her responsibility or blame external circumstances. It acknowledged the specific ways she'd hurt me and showed understanding of why those actions had been so damaging. But I realized, as I sat there thinking about how to respond, that I didn't need her apology anymore. I'd moved beyond needing validation from someone who had abused me, beyond needing to hear her explain or justify or ask for forgiveness. The anger and hurt and confusion that had consumed me for so long were gone, replaced by something calmer and more stable. I understood now what had happened and why. I understood that Emma's choices had been about her own insecurity and resentment, not about anything lacking in me. I understood that the abuse said more about who she was than about who I was. Most importantly, I understood that my well-being didn't depend on her acknowledgement of wrongdoing or her growth as a person. Those things were nice, but they weren't necessary for my peace of mind. I decided not to respond to the letter, not out of cruelty or spite, but because there was nothing I needed to say to her that would improve either of our lives. The conversation was over. The chapter was closed. I was focused on moving forward, not on rehashing the past. Instead, I wrote a different letter that night. A letter to myself, reflecting on everything I'd learned and everything I'd survived. Dear Margaret, I wrote, you have been through hell in the past few years. You have lost your husband, discovered that your son and daughter-in-law were stealing from you, endured financial abuse and emotional manipulation, faced a frivolous lawsuit, and watched your daughter-in-law go to prison for using your dead husband's identity to commit fraud. Any one of those experiences would have been enough to break someone, but you didn't break. You bent, you grieved, you struggled, you questioned yourself and your worth and your judgment, but you didn't break. You learned to say no to people who were hurting you, even when saying no meant risking being alone. You learned to value yourself for who you are, not just for what you can provide to other people. You learned the difference between love and enablement, between kindness and being a doormat. You survived betrayal by the people closest to you and discovered that you are strong enough to protect yourself, even when no one else will. You created a new life, with new routines and new interests and new sources of joy. Most importantly, you learned that being alone is not the same thing as being lonely, and that being treated poorly by people who claim to love you is worse than being single. You deserve to be proud of yourself. You deserve to wake up every morning knowing that you are worthwhile, that you are strong, that you are capable of creating happiness for yourself, regardless of how other people choose to treat you. You are not a victim anymore. You are a survivor, and survivors get to decide what comes next. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer where I kept important documents, my new will, my power of attorney forms, the settlement agreement from the lawsuit. Someday, maybe Tommy would find it when he was helping to settle my affairs. Maybe it would help him understand what his grandmother had lived through, and how she'd found the strength to rebuild her life at an age when most people think their stories are already written, or maybe no one would ever read it except me, and that would be fine too. The act of writing it, of acknowledging my own journey and growth, was valuable in itself. Spring came again, my third spring as a widow, and with it a restlessness I hadn't felt in years. I found myself looking through travel brochures at the community center, researching bus tours to places Michael and I had talked about visiting someday. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had become my closest friend and confidant, encouraged me to book something. "You have money saved now," she pointed out. "You have no one to answer to except yourself. Tommy is old enough that Peter can handle a weekend or even a week without your help. What are you waiting for?" What was I waiting for? Permission from whom? Michael was dead. Peter and I had a civil but distant relationship. Tommy would be proud of me for doing something adventurous. I was waiting for myself to believe that I deserved to spend money on my own happiness. The realization was startling. After years of working 2 jobs and giving away every extra dollar to family members who didn't appreciate the sacrifice, after months of financial abuse and identity theft and legal battles, I still hadn't fully absorbed the idea that I was allowed to use my own money for my own enjoyment. But Mrs. Rodriguez was right. I had savings now, money from the settlement, plus the income from my one remaining job at the office building, plus the Social Security benefits that finally felt like enough because I wasn't supporting an entire extended family on them. I could afford to travel. I could afford to do things I wanted to do instead of always putting other people's needs first. I could afford to live a little. That afternoon, I booked a 5-day bus tour to Washington, D.C. and Virginia, visiting gardens and historical sites and monuments. It was scheduled for late May, when the weather would be mild and the cherry blossoms might still be blooming around the tidal basin. It would be my first real vacation in over a decade. My first trip anywhere as a single person. My first major purchase that was purely for my own pleasure and no one else's benefit. I was terrified and excited in equal measure. Tommy was thrilled when I told him about the trip. "That's so cool, Grandma. You're going to see the White House and the Lincoln Memorial and all the museums. Will you take lots of pictures?" "Of course. And I'll bring you back something interesting from the gift shops." "You don't have to bring me anything. I just want you to have fun." It was such a simple statement, but it moved me almost to tears. When was the last time someone in my family had wanted me to have fun without expecting anything in return? When was the last time someone had cared about my happiness just because they loved me, not because they wanted something from me? Peter's reaction was more complex when I mentioned the trip during one of our coordination calls about Tommy's schedule. "You're traveling alone? Is that safe at your age?" "It's a bus tour with 30 other people, Peter. I'm not hitchhiking across the country. We never talked about you traveling alone. What if something happens?" There was something in his voice that I couldn't quite identify. Concern, obviously, but something else too. Something that sounded almost like abandonment anxiety. "Peter, I'm 75 years old. I've been taking care of myself just fine for 3 years now. And if something does happen, you're my emergency contact. But I can't live my whole life avoiding experiences because something might go wrong. I know, it's just, after everything that happened with Emma and the lawsuit, and I guess I got used to thinking of you as someone who needed protection. I needed protection from financial abuse. I don't need protection from life." That conversation stayed with me as I prepared for the trip. I realized that Peter's perception of me had shifted from seeing me as a resource to be exploited to seeing me as a fragile person who needed to be shielded from the world. Both perspectives were problematic, but at least the second one came from a place of caring rather than manipulation. Still, I didn't want to be seen as fragile or helpless. I wanted to be seen as capable and independent and entitled to make my own choices about how to spend my time and money. The bus tour was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. I shared a room with a widow from Connecticut named Dorothy, who had also decided that life was too short to wait for other people's permission to be happy. We bonded over early morning coffee and late-night conversations about reinventing ourselves in our 70s. I saw the cherry blossoms around the Washington Monument, pale pink petals falling like snow on the pathways, while tourists from dozens of countries took photographs and marveled at the beauty. I walked through the Smithsonian museums, absorbing art and history and scientific exhibits that reminded me how vast and fascinating the world was beyond my small apartment in Queens. I ate dinner in restaurants I'd never heard of, trying foods I'd never tasted before. I bought postcards for Tommy and souvenirs that caught my eye just because they made me happy. I took hundreds of photographs, not because anyone expected me to document the trip, but because I wanted to remember every detail of this adventure I'd given myself. Most importantly, I discovered that I was good company for myself, that I could spend 5 days with strangers and feel comfortable and confident and socially engaged, that I could navigate airports and hotels and tour schedules without anyone's help, that I could make decisions about how to spend my time based purely on my own interests and preferences. I came home feeling more like myself than I had since Michael died. More like the woman I'd been before grief and financial stress and family drama had consumed my entire life. Tommy was waiting for me when I got back to the apartment, eager to hear about everything I'd seen and done. I showed him photographs on my digital camera and gave him the Lincoln Memorial snow globe I'd picked out for him at the gift shop. "You look different, Grandma," he said as we were going through the pictures together. "Happier. I feel different. It was a good trip." "Are you going to do more traveling?" "I think so. Maybe not right away, but yes. I'd like to see more of the world while I'm still healthy enough to enjoy it." "Where would you want to go next?" I thought about it. "Maybe the Grand Canyon. Your grandfather always wanted to see that. Or maybe New England in the fall, to see the leaves changing. Or maybe somewhere completely different, the Pacific Northwest or the South, or even out of the country someday." "That sounds amazing. I hope when I'm your age, I'll be brave enough to travel by myself." "You're already brave enough," I told him. "You just need to remember that you deserve to do things that make you happy, even if other people don't understand why they make you happy." That summer, I signed up for a photography class at the community center, inspired by all the pictures I'd taken during my trip to Washington. I wanted to learn how to use my camera more effectively, how to see light and composition the way artists do. The class was taught by a retired professional photographer named Frank, who had spent 30 years documenting New York City for magazines and newspapers. He was around my age, recently widowed, and passionate about helping people find creative outlets for their experiences and emotions. "Photography is about seeing," he told our class during the first session. "Not just looking, but really seeing. Seeing the light, seeing the relationships between objects, seeing the story that's happening in front of you." I thought about that idea a lot as I practiced with my camera around the neighborhood. What story was I seeing? What was I choosing to focus on? I found myself drawn to images of resilience and renewal. Flowers growing through cracks in the sidewalk, old buildings being renovated and restored, children playing in parks that had been built on lots that used to be empty and abandoned. The city was full of stories about things that had been broken and were being made whole again, things that had been written off and were proving they still had value, things that had been forgotten and were finding ways to be noticed again. Maybe those were the stories I needed to tell with my camera. Maybe those were the stories I was living in my own life. Frank was encouraging and patient with all of his students, but I felt like he paid special attention to my work. He would spend extra time looking at my photographs during review sessions, pointing out things I'd done well and suggesting techniques that might help me improve. After one class, he asked if I'd like to join him for coffee at the diner down the street. "I hope this doesn't seem presumptuous," he said as we settled into a booth by the window. "But I've been wondering about your story. Your photographs have such an emotional depth to them, like you're working through something important." I found myself telling him about Michael's death, about the financial abuse and identity theft, about the process of rebuilding my life and learning to value myself. He listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was really paying attention. "No wonder your pictures are so powerful," he said when I'd finished. "You're documenting your own resurrection." It was such a beautiful way to describe what I'd been doing, both with my camera and with my life. Resurrection, not just recovery, but transformation into something new and stronger. "I lost my wife to cancer 2 years ago," Frank said, "and I went through my own period of wondering who I was without her, what my purpose was, whether life was still worth living. Photography saved me, honestly. It gave me a reason to get up in the morning and look for beauty in the world." "Is that why you teach the class?" "Partly, but also because I've learned that healing happens in community, that sharing our stories and our art with other people who understand makes the journey less lonely." We started meeting for coffee after every class. Not dates exactly, but companionship. Two people who had survived loss and were learning to create meaning from their experiences. Two people who understood that rebuilding a life was both interior work and something that happened in relationship with others. Frank never pushed for anything more than friendship, and I was grateful for that. I wasn't ready for romance, might never be ready for romance, but I was ready for the kind of deep, respectful connection that comes when two people have both been through enough to know what really matters. He became my photography mentor and walking companion. We would spend Saturday mornings exploring different neighborhoods with our cameras, looking for interesting light and unexpected compositions. He taught me about aperture and shutter speed and the rule of thirds. I taught him about resilience and the difference between solitude and loneliness. By the end of the summer, I had assembled a portfolio of photographs that told the story of my neighborhood, my city, and my own journey toward self-worth. Frank helped me matte and frame the best ones, and I hung them in my apartment alongside my watercolor paintings. The apartment was becoming a gallery of my own growth and creativity. Every wall told part of the story of who I was becoming, not just who I had been. Tommy loved the photographs. During one of his weekend visits, he spent an hour studying them, asking questions about where I'd taken them and what I'd been thinking about when I composed each shot. "Grandma, you're like an artist now," he said. "I mean, You were always artistic. But now you're creating things that tell stories about important stuff. What kind of stories do you think they tell? He considered this seriously, walking from picture to picture, looking at each one with the focused attention I'd learned to appreciate about his personality. Stories about things that look broken but aren't really broken, he said finally. Stories about things that are stronger than they look. Stories about survival, maybe? I hugged him tight, overwhelmed by his insight and his ability to see what I'd been trying to express without even knowing it myself. That's exactly right, I said. Stories about survival. Fall came, and with it Tommy's 14th birthday. He was taller than me now, his voice fully changed, his interest shifting toward things I didn't always understand. But he still wanted to spend his birthday with me, still valued our conversations and our creative time together. For his birthday gift, I gave him a framed photograph I'd taken of him painting at my easel, completely absorbed in mixing colors on his palette. His expression was one of pure concentration and joy, the expression of someone doing something he loved simply for the pleasure of doing it. This is my favorite picture anyone has ever taken of me, he said, studying it with the same serious attention he gave to everything he cared about. I look, I don't know, like myself, I guess. That's because you were being yourself when I took it. You weren't performing for anyone or trying to be anything other than exactly who you are. Is that what happiness looks like? Just being yourself? I think so. I think happiness is when the outside world and the inside world match up, when you don't have to pretend or hide or perform to be accepted. We were sitting in my living room, surrounded by the artwork and photographs that had become my way of documenting and celebrating this new phase of my life. The late afternoon light was streaming through my windows, golden and warm, making everything look richer and more beautiful. Grandma, are you happy now? It was such a direct question, asked with such genuine curiosity, that I had to think carefully about how to answer it. Yes, I said, surprised by how easily the word came. Yes, I think I am happy. Not the way I was happy when I was married to your grandfather, but a different kind of happiness. Quieter, maybe, but also stronger. More mine. What do you mean, more yours? I mean that it doesn't depend on anyone else's choices or behavior. It doesn't require other people to appreciate me, or validate me, or even understand me. It comes from knowing who I am and liking who I am and treating myself with the same kindness I would want someone I love to be treated. Tommy nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like a better kind of happiness. Like it's more reliable or something. More reliable, that's a good way to put it. That evening, after Tommy had gone home to have birthday dinner with Peter, I sat in my chair with a cup of tea and reflected on the question he'd asked me. Was I happy? 3 years ago, if someone had told me that my husband would die, my son would sue me, my daughter-in-law would go to prison for identity theft, and I would end up living alone at 75 with limited contact with my family, I would have thought that scenario represented the worst possible outcome for my life. But sitting there in my apartment, surrounded by my art and my photographs, and the evidence of the creative, independent life I'd built for myself, I realized that what had seemed like catastrophe had actually been liberation. I was no longer working 2 jobs to support people who didn't value my sacrifice. I was no longer walking on eggshells, trying to manage other people's emotions and financial problems. I was no longer pouring my energy into relationships that drained me without giving anything meaningful back. Instead, I was painting and taking photographs and traveling and learning new skills and having conversations with people who appreciated my perspective and enjoyed my company. I was reading books I wanted to read, eating food I enjoyed, spending my time on activities that brought me satisfaction and growth. I was no longer defined by my usefulness to other people. I was defined by my own interests, my own values, my own choices about how to spend the years I had left. Was I happy? Yes, I was happy. Perhaps happier than I'd ever been as an adult, because this happiness was built on self-knowledge and self-respect, rather than external validation and other people's approval. Winter settled over the city again, but this time I welcomed it instead of dreading it. I had projects to work on, a series of watercolor paintings inspired by my photographs, a photo essay about urban renewal that Frank was helping me develop. I had plans for the spring, another bus tour, this one to New England to see the historical sites I'd been reading about. Most importantly, I had a sense of purpose that came from within, rather than from trying to meet other people's needs and expectations. On New Year's Eve, Mrs. Rodriguez and I cooked dinner together and toasted the year that was ending and the year that was beginning. Frank joined us along with 2 other neighbors from our building who had become part of our informal community of people who understood that family isn't just about blood relationships. To new beginnings, Mrs. Rodriguez said, raising her wine glass, and to old friendships. To surviving and thriving, Frank added. To learning the difference between love and abuse, I said, surprising myself with how easily the words came, and to never forgetting that difference again. We clinked glasses and sat down to a meal that was abundant without being wasteful, celebratory without being excessive, shared without anyone keeping score of who had contributed what. This was what family could look like when it was based on genuine affection and mutual respect, instead of obligation and manipulation. This was what love looked like when it was freely given and gratefully received instead of demanded and extracted. As midnight approached, I stood at my window looking out at the city that had been my home for so many decades. The same streets and buildings and rhythms I'd known since I was a young wife, but seen now through different eyes. Eyes that had learned to recognize my own worth, to protect my own well-being, to create my own happiness. The fireworks started just after midnight, brilliant explosions of color against the dark sky. I watched them reflect in the windows of the buildings across the courtyard, brief and beautiful and gone almost as soon as they appeared. Like life itself, I thought. Brief and beautiful and gone before you know it. Too precious to waste on people who don't appreciate it. Too valuable to spend on relationships that diminish rather than enhance your sense of self. I had learned finally and fully that being alone was not the worst thing that could happen to me. Being used, being abused, being taken for granted, being treated as less than I was worth, those were worse than being alone. Being alone had opened up space for me to discover who I was beyond my roles as wife and mother and grandmother and financial supporter. Being alone had given me permission to invest in my own growth and creativity and happiness. Being alone had taught me the difference between loneliness and solitude, between isolation and independence, between being abandoned and being free. Would I have chosen this path if I'd known at the beginning where it would lead? Would I have willingly given up the illusion of close family relationships in exchange for genuine self-respect and authentic happiness? I honestly didn't know. The journey had been too painful, too full of loss and betrayal, and moments when I wasn't sure I was strong enough to continue. But standing at my window on New Year's Eve, surrounded by the evidence of the life I'd built from the ruins of my old expectations, I knew with absolute certainty that I was grateful for where I'd ended up. I was grateful for the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving betrayal, grateful for the self-knowledge that came from being forced to rely on myself, grateful for the peace that came from no longer trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it freely. Most of all, I was grateful for the time I had left to live as the woman I'd discovered myself to be, strong enough to protect myself, creative enough to find beauty and meaning in unexpected places, wise enough to recognize real love when it showed up, and brave enough to reject the counterfeit versions that had caused me so much pain. The fireworks ended, leaving the sky dark and quiet again. I closed the curtains and got ready for bed, thinking about the year ahead and all the possibilities it might hold. Tomorrow, I would wake up in a home that belonged to me, in a life that belonged to me, with a day ahead that I could fill however I chose. I would paint or take photographs or read or visit with friends or plan another trip, or simply sit quietly and enjoy the peace that came from knowing I was exactly where I belonged. I would wake up free. Have you ever lived something like this? Have you ever had to choose between being used by people you love and protecting yourself, even when protection meant risking being alone? Please share your story in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else who's struggling with similar choices. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to help me keep sharing these difficult but important stories. Together, we can remind each other that we deserve to be treated with respect, even by the people we love most. Remember, love that requires you to accept abuse is not love. Family that demands you sacrifice your well-being for their convenience is not family. You deserve relationships that lift you up, not tear you down. And if you're in a situation where you're being exploited or manipulated or taken for granted, please know that it's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to say no. It's never too late to discover who you are when you're not busy being everything everyone else needs you to be. You are worth protecting. You are worth celebrating. You are worth the effort it takes to build a life that honors your value and your dignity. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise.